So now we're going to get started with our create a recipe view. So we'll open up the recipes. Within here we're going to create a new template directory. So we're going to have our templates, recipes, and we're going to create the add recipe file. So the next thing we need to do is create a urls.py because we'll need that file in order to create our URL pattern. So we'll now go into the views and we're going to create our first view. So we'll get rid of the boilerplate code in here because we're going to be using Django's class-based views, not the renders. So we're going to say from django.views.generic import create view. So the create view is a class-based view. It's specifically just for creating. So we'll be able to just give it a template name in the recipes, and there is a lot of code underneath that allows us to do it with very, very minimal code. So that's why I'm picking the create view. So we'll go ahead and define our class. So we'll have a class of add recipe. We are then going to pass in the create view so it knows what kind of view we're using. I'll give it my doc string. And we'll go ahead and give it a template name. So by specifying a template name, we are telling it which template we want it to load. So that's going to be the recipes and the add recipe.html page. So the next thing we need to do is we need to tell it what model it's going to be using to create. So we're going to have to go and import our model. So we can say from .models import recipe. Okay, so if you remember from earlier, that just means from this directory there is a model called recipe and we'll import that one. So we can now go ahead and tell it that the model we want to use is the recipe model. The next thing I'm going to give it is a success URL. So the success URL is where it will redirect if the form submits successfully. So I'm just going to say that that's /recipes. And I'm also going to give it a form valid function. So I can define form valid, which will override the default form valid. So form valid takes in the self parameter and a form. So we don't have the form yet, but we'll create that next and we'll come back and edit this so it'll know which form is being used. So what we want to do here is we want to update the user. So as I said earlier, when we created the first recipe in the admin panel, we had to select the user. So we don't want the user to have to select their own name for a form, A, because it's not very user friendly, and B, they could put anybody's name in there. So what we want to do is before we allow the form to submit, we want to update the instance of that user. So if we go back to our models, we have our foreign key on user. So we want to update this specific instance, so the forms instance of the user, and set it to the person that is creating the recipe. So to do that, we can say form.instance.user is equal to self.request.user. So the self.request.user is the logged in user. So we're then going to return super, and that is a function that takes in our parent view, which is our add recipe class, and self, and then we can say dot form valid and pass in our form. So once that form is valid, it's successful, it will then go ahead and reload. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add it in the forms.py file. So within our forms, we're going to import forms. So from Django, Import forms. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to import our rich text widget. So if you remember our ingredients and our instructions, we're using our rich text field. So we need to import the widget in order for us to be able to load that into the form. So from dj rich text field dot widgets, import the rich text widget. And finally, we need to load in our recipe model so that it knows which model this form is for. So from .models, we'll import our recipe. So we'll go ahead now and create our form. So again, we're creating a class and we're going to call that recipe form. And that is going to be a forms.model form. Next, we'll define our class meta. So our class meta will contain everything that we need to give to the form. So the form will need the model name, so we can say the model is the recipe. We'll give it the fields that we want it to have on the form. So that's going to be the title, the description, the ingredients, the instructions, the image field, the image alt, the meal type, the cuisine type, and finally the calories. We will just correct a typo here. That should be cuisine types, not cuisine type. So next we're going to go ahead and we're going to add our widgets. So we're going to say ingredients is a forms.char field, and we're going to give that a parameter of widget equals rich text widget. Okay, and that is a function, so we use our parentheses. So we'll do the same thing for the instructions, and that will ensure that our widgets load properly for that. We're then also going to create a text area widget for our description field. Because our description field is not a rich text field, but it might be quite long, we want to just give it some additional text area so that the rows are wider without having to do much CSS in the background. So if we just say the description field is a forms.text area, and that's going to have the attributes of rows, and we'll specify 5 rows. The last thing that I want to do is just add in our labels. So we want to override the label names. So the left hand side of this is our actual form field's name, and the right hand side is the label we want it to display. So for our title, I will have recipe title. For our description, I will have description. For our ingredients, I will have recipe ingredients. For instructions, I'll have recipe instructions. Image, recipe image. Image alt will be describe image. We'll have meal type as meal type, cuisine types as cuisine type, and finally calories as calories. So now that we have our form created, we can go back to our views.py and we can import the form. So from .forms, import recipe form, and within our class we can then specify a form class, and that is going to be our recipe form for it to load. So now we need to create a URL pattern in order to get this to load. So we'll go ahead into our urls.py and we will import from Django URLs, import path. We then need to import our view, so from .views, import add recipe. We'll then go ahead and create our URL patterns. We'll create a new path. We'll say this one's going to be at the root of our recipes app. We'll then give it our add recipe class, and we'll say that we want that class to load as a view, and we will give it a name of add recipe. So you remember our name is how we're going to call that from our navbar. So we'll go ahead now and we'll add that into our navigation menu. So we'll go into our includes folder, into the header, and we will now change this up with our curly brace percentage syntax, and we will say URL, and the URL we are loading is add recipe. So we may as well go ahead now and also add in our active class. So we'll add this into the nav, and this will be on add recipe. So next up, we'll go ahead and create our recipe page. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to extend it from our base.html. We're then going to add in our block title. So you remember we wanted a different title on each page. So we'll call that add recipe and close our block. The next thing we need to do then is load our block tag. So you remember we have our block content tag. I'm then going to create a div with a class of container. So div.container, we'll hit our tab to create that div. I'm then going to create a new form with a method of post. So we're now going to give it an encode type, and we're going to say that is multi-part form data. Now, if we don't add the encode type, what will actually happen is when we try and upload any files or our media, it will not make it to Cloudinary, because by default the forms will upload text content, but you need to tell it if you're trying to upload files. So we'll give it a class of P2 to give it a little bit of padding, and we will give it the form class that we created in earlier videos. I will now give it a heading level 1, and I will center that with our Bootstrap Text Center class, and that will say add recipe. We will then go ahead and add our CRSF token, form.media. And now we will load our form. So if you remember, we gave it a form class within our view. So by default, that will be named form. So in some of our later videos for part 2, we may be having two forms on the same page, in which case we will send them back through the context and we can rename them. So I'm now going to create another div with a class of text center. I'm going to create a button element with a type of submit and our button classes. So BTN, BTN primary, and some margin top of 2. So this will say create recipe. We then need to close our block content tag, so we will do that with our end block. So the last thing that we're going to do here is go ahead to the urls.py and we're going to add a new path, and this will be recipes. So that will be our domain /recipes and then any other sub URL patterns we have in our recipes urls.py. We use the include keyword with our recipes.urls. So if we would start our run server now and actually try and add a recipe, that would work if we are logged in. But unfortunately, what we have not done yet is set it to require the user to log in. So if we go back to our form valid, we're setting the instance user as the person who's logged in and is trying to request that. So what will actually happen here is if we're not logged in and we try to add a recipe, then we're going to actually hit an issue because there isn't going to be anybody logged in. So when it tries to set this, it will crash. So one thing we can do to mitigate this is we can use a mixin to ensure that the user has to be logged in. So from django.contrib.auth.mixins, we can import the login required mixin and pass this as a parameter to our class. So before it attempts to run the create view, it will check if the user is logged in first. So if we go ahead and start our run server, so if I attempt to hit this new button, we are now redirected to the login page. So if I log in with the super user we created earlier, I can now access the add recipe page.